Greetings, theists and non-theists. I'm the Atheist Paladin. And recently I went to a seminar called Unpacking Atheism. And it was hosted by William Lane Craig, Lee Stroble, and Mark Middleberg. And basically, overall, if you didn't go, you didn't miss nothing much. If you're familiar with William Lane Craig's apologetics, you know exactly what you missed, which was pretty much nothing new. And so I'll just get to it. They start off with Lee Stroble and Mark Middleberg. They talk for a little bit. They sort of get you in, and then the door, and they sort of Mark says he emphasizes the importance of seeking truth, and that this whole exercise is about seeking truth. But Lee kind of comes in back behind that and says, well, we don't have an agenda. The agenda is to spread the gospel. So there goes that. So, but it's kind of emphasized a little here and a little there. It's sort of a motif when it comes to, intellectual honesty being important. But it just seems to be drowned out by the fact that it's obviously not when you actually pay attention. So they bring Liam Wayne Craig out, and they have him sort of do his whole spiel, his life story, basically. And he says that he's, never really an atheist. He already pretty much had a general theistic belief through all his life. But then he met this Christian girl that was always happy and cheerful. And so eventually that sort of led him to the Lord, sort of. And what got him into apologetics is that not everyone around his life was a Christian, so he's sort of defending his reasons in order to be Christian and things like that. And then he went to college, and intellectualism and Christianity didn't seem to be at odds for him. So the rest is history. So we have William Lane Craig as we now know him, basically. And so they finally get into the meat of the matter about atheism, and they define the difference between new atheism and the regular old brand, I suppose. And old atheism was just a way to promote secularism. It didn't really matter what you did at home, but as far as the public sphere goes, it has to be completely neutral and devoid of religion. But old atheism, new atheism, it was about, destroy all religion. It's religion poison everything. Which Hitchens used to say. So then they finally go into defining what atheism is, as opposed to the movement itself. And they start off, well, atheists are trying to find it as a lack of belief. And then they kind of poke fun at it. Well, that technically makes children and animals and objects atheists. And I find that kind of funny. Because it's kind of like saying a chair is a bachelor because it's unmarried. No, it's not. It's about things that could have the belief in God, namely us people, but we don't have a belief in God. We just don't believe. It's just basically another word for non-belief. I'm just not a believer. Whether the reasons that I have or a complete negation of theism or simply a lack of evidence is irrelevant. But William Lane Craig insists that the actual definition of atheism is the negation of theism, and that as a result is a claim and thus has a burden of proof. And of course, atheists want it to be the lack of belief because they don't want to bear the burden of proof. No. But then he kind of gets ridiculous by going, well, let's just call this smatheism. Okay, is anybody going to take you seriously after this point? It's like anybody take you seriously after your discussion with Hitchens and it was about theism. No one's going to take him seriously. And so the first thing that they bring up is, okay, well, atheists sort of have this first weapon, which is the problem of evil, or the problem of suffering, right? And of course the first horrible thing he says that goes wrong is, well, it's mainly an emotional objection and not an intellectual one. Okay, I can understand why people will be upset with the existence of suffering, but that doesn't diminish that they have an emotional reaction to an intellectual problem. That doesn't diminish it whatsoever. If anything, the intellectual problem is what helps spurs the emotional reaction. Because if I showed you, the last person who sold you a car, and they actually ripped you off, you would actually be kind of mad. That doesn't mean that, oh, he didn't rip you off because you got mad. It means you were just having a proper response to something. Just like you would have a response to a parent that, I don't know, starved their child, beat their child, and put them all sorts of through all sorts of hell, right? And then when you ask the parent why they do this, it was, well, I have my reasons. Would you accept that? No, of course you wouldn't. And the fact that William Lane Craig says that the intellectual part is not really a problem, as long as there is a potential solution. The problem of evil isn't a problem. As long as there is a potential solution. Well, in my opinion, it follows deductively, but even if you grant that and say it's an inductive, just saying that there's a solution doesn't mean there is one. The argument is still valid until you can show that it's not. So it's up to you to proffer an actual robust theodicy or theodicy. But they don't. It's sort of like saying, well, when you're a square circle can exist, and then I ask you, how can that be? How can you have something 4 corners but be have a radius of everything being of equal distance? And they can't answer that. Well, it can't exist. I don't know how, but it can't. Well, this is sort of the same thing. It just doesn't work. Until you can show that it works, until you can show there's actually no problem, then it actually is a problem. And then, of course, he goes into his old canard. Well, if atheists say that there's evil, well, then that proves objective morals. And I don't, even after watching lots and lots of what William Lane Craig says about objective morals, I still don't know what he means by objective morals. I don't know how a God makes morals objective. And when talking about this, okay, we have a being that's all powerful and tells you to do something. But he's still a being. He is still giving his subjective opinion. Just because he can universally enforce it doesn't change anything. And the fact of the matter is I don't need a God to tell me that pain is bad and pleasure is good. It hurts with pain, and it feels good with pleasure. And so as a rational being and a rational agent, I can go and see that, hey, this hurts somebody else, and therefore I shouldn't do it. Kind of easy to get there. Then he goes into his good old canard about Kalam. And Kalam is a good, apparently good argument. And yet he still has yet to justify the premise, which is based on observed observations of creation ex material. And instead of showing that there necessarily needs to be a cause for creation ex nihilo. But you can't ever do that, so that's kind of funny. And then he says, well, even if we grant him all that, he goes through all these supposed lists of properties of what it would actually entail, of what sort of thing could do this. And majority of them are simply negative terms. Timeless, spaceless, massless, you know, sort of material-less, and I don't know what those things are. And then he says God is all powerful, immensely powerful. I guess he's trying to get away from the, I don't know, the problem of omnipotence, and it's personal. What does that even mean? Why does it have to be a personal being? Why can't it be just a force? And he can't really explain that. It's just, well, God is personal, and then therefore, if it's personal, then therefore it's actually interested in your actions, apparently, and your existence. That just doesn't seem to add up. And then we get to the fine-tuning argument, and then he says something rather curious about fine-tuning. I'll get to that in a moment. But of course, he doesn't realize that fine-tuning makes some very bad assumptions. Half the time when people say something is finely tuned, it turns out it's not. And even so, they're making an assumption that this is not finely tuned into certain variances, right? That this is one, everything else is stuck at one dial, and then if you change this, then everything goes haywire. What Victor Stenger showed is that you can still get a universe with all sorts of different variables, but as long as some are within certain ratios of each other, it actually kind of works out. So there's actually a possibility of lots of universes with different variances that could still create life, or a universe that is actually similar to ours. But this is what William Lane Craig says about the many universes, the infinite universes, and that is sort of like it's a backhanded compliment. And sort of like, oh, this is, because it's such a powerful argument, they have to invent infinite universes, which he actually sort of hints or implies. And that is just plain wrong. It's not just a metaphysical proposition that is brought out the necessity of the fine-tuning argument. That is complete shite. And it actually comes out of the numbers of, guess what? Physics. It comes out of the numbers of trying to actually solve for the problems of physics. So it's part of the numbers, it's part of the math that makes some of this work. So it's not just a metaphysical proposition that's pulled out of there. It's actually a part of the explanation. And then he gets to the far admission that, well, these arguments are not really for Christianity, they're just generic. But he says, well, that's fine, that's just part of the answer. But what really Christianity stands or falls is the historicity. Finally, he actually admits something. And of course he says, well, it's historical, and then he brings up the classic four of, you know, Jesus was in Joseph Mather's tomb, and the disciples switched over, and they were believers that he was risen, and he was visited by the women, and things like that. But none of these historical truths can ever be attested to outside the gospel. It's kind of funny. You say it's historically true, but when I ask you what your source is, and try to track your sources, your only sources is the gospel. And again, that's using the Bible to prove the Bible. That's just ridiculous. And that's pretty much of that segment. Of course, intermission. And then they go to come back. After come back, we're going to have these two atheists, or two former atheists, that converted to Christianity. So it's basically two life stories, basically. One is by Dr. Holly Orway, someone who's actually some sort of professor and now in, guess what? Apologetics. But her life story is that she was more of a pagan than an atheist. But she eventually was sort of like this generic sort of atheist thing. And she thought faith was believing in something without reason. She says so you can't do that. She doesn't do that, and she can't do that now, and won't ever do that. So apparently, her faith is fulfilling to her. Well, and what eventually kind of brought her over to the Christian side and asking questions of Christians she knew and was a good friend of that wasn't actually pushy. She actually noticed that most Christians were pushy. But the ones that weren't pushy, she was actually asking questions of. And she found that the cosmological and the moral argument sort of brought her over to theism. Well, I've already pointed out the flaws in both of those, so that's pretty much her discussion. And so she's an academic, and she came to be a Christian, and now she does apologetics. Now, I was not really impressed. And then there's Randall. He was raised a Christian, but then he got to the teenage years and he went through his, of course, rebellious stage. And it is throughout the rest of his life, you know, his atheism was hedonistic and materialistic. But then his mother when he got to his 30s, I think, his mother got cancer. And that what really led him down to Christianity, his emotional response to the final death of his mother. And they say atheists do it for emotional reasons. He's pretty much says it in so many words that he started seeking religion because of his fear of death. And then he says, well, DNA is